Go touch it. Wow. I have been fretting and fretting about this, fearing, what if nobody comes? What if they say they didn't they didn't know about it? So thank you all. Thank you, thank you. What a great crowd for an off day, an odd day. And what a great speaker we have today. Bill Geroux we have books in the back, they're hardback. The book came out, I believe, last week. Is that correct, Bill?
Yes.
And Bill just had knee surgery and he's traveling around a lot, so we're very lucky to have him here. We have books for sale in the back if you'd like to buy one, and Bill will sign them for you. And we have a rough draft of the upcoming season. Now, it is a rough draft. The speakers that you see will be here, but I don't have titles. And I remember my mother always saying, I can't get the speakers to send me their titles. It just takes a long time because they're busy too. So when I have everybody's title, I will give it to Brianna and we will put it out on Facebook and it'll be everywhere. So be on the lookout. Okay, so today we have author Bill Geroux, and he did speak with us last summer about the Matthews men, and he's also the author of the Ghost Ships of the Archangel. Today we're going to hear about his brand new book, The 15, and I will give you his background. William Bill Geroux is the author of 3 nonfiction books. Before he became an author, he was an award-winning journalist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch who covered Hopewell in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Born in Washington, D.C., he grew up in Alexandria and was graduated from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. He now lives in Virginia Beach. So I welcome Bill Geroux.
Mine. Thanks. Good afternoon. And thank you all for coming out. It's a great crowd. Thank you. I'm glad I have not completely worn out my welcome in Hopewell, having been here last summer. I was talking about book The Matthews Men. Today I'm talking about a different book, my new book, The 15, which just came out last week. It is a tale of murder, mayhem, and hostage diplomacy out of the vast network of German POW camps that we used to have here all over the United States in World War II. And this may sound kind of unscholarly, but I knew absolutely nothing about these camps until 2018. I was taking a book back to my local library in Virginia Beach, and they had a brand new historical marker, you know, one of those markers planted right in front of the library, and it said that on this site where the library was in World War II was a big German POW camp that held 6,000 captured soldiers of Adolf Hitler. And it also added that this camp was one of hundreds, more than 600 across the United States that together held more than almost 400,000 German POWs. Now that's like 4 armies worth of captured Germans. And my first thought on looking at this was, how in the world do I not know this already? Because I'm always been fascinated by World War II. My dad was in the 82nd Airborne, fought all over Europe, and he, like a lot of people of his generation, never really talked very much about it. But he told me just enough to sort of generate a lifelong interest by me in World War II. So I've seen countless movies about World War II. I've read countless books. I've had even written 2 books on World War II myself. So how do I not know that there's a German POW camp just a few miles from my house? And how do I not know that there were hundreds of these things all over the country? And the second thing I thought was, you know, I write books, and if I don't know this, chances are there's a lot of other people that don't know very much about it. So I started looking into it. And I went in the library, no books on the subject in the library. I drove around the area where the camp was, no trace of the camp. So I went home and I got on the internet and I plunged into this internet rabbit hole about these new camps. A really big rabbit hole. There was all kinds of information online about these camps, not just the one in Virginia Beach, but all over the country. And I was reading these things just with amazement, and to my surprise, a lot of these memories were fond, kind of warm memories of the camps, by the guards, by the people that lived around the camps, because the Germans came out from the camps every day and worked for businesses around, on the fringes of the camps, and they helped keep a lot of those businesses going. So it was. But and maybe I was a reporter for 25, 30 years, and maybe I've got maybe a little bit cynical in that period. Doing that will get you that way. And I thought, there's no way we brought almost 400,000 captured Nazis to American soil in World War II at the height of the war, and nothing went sideways. Nothing went kind of in a way people didn't expect. So I started looking around. And there was some stuff online about escapes. And that's what we were really worried about. The Nazis were going to escape and they were going to run around and rape and pillage and sabotage their way across the United States. But that really didn't happen. And when you think about it, you can see why. Because if you're in a camp, it's easy enough to kind of walk away from a work detail or slip out from behind the wire. But what do you do then if you're in the United States, if you're in Stalag America? Because if you're in like Kansas or Oklahoma, you get out from a camp, you're thousands of miles from the nearest ocean. You're a long way even from the border of Canada or Mexico. And both of them were at war with Nazi Germany. So if you get out, you are a hunted man just from the moment you leave. And you've got to travel at night, hide during the day, you're stealing food, the sheriff is after you, the farmers with shotguns, the state police, the FBI. There's no resistance groups, no Nazi, support groups to help you. So the escapes really didn't amount to anything. And I thought, well, that's not it. But I also noticed that I saw some references to some murders. And these were not murders of like German POWs breaking out of the camps and killing Americans. They were murders of Germans in the camps killing other Germans in the camps. And I thought, and it wasn't just one or two of them, there was a bunch of these. And I thought, well, what is that about? And something told me that these murders might be like the dark heart of this story of the POWs. So I started looking into it. And as I looked into it, I just found surprise after surprise after surprise. And I ended up with a story that I don't think anybody has ever fully told before. And that is the subject of my book, The 15. The first Germans to arrive in the United States in 1943 were veterans, battle-tested, most of them veterans of the German Afrika Korps. And the Afrika Korps was Hitler's elite desert expeditionary force. He sent these guys down to North Africa mainly to fight the British, to help out the Italians, his allies, who were getting their butts kicked by the British. So they head out there, and the Afrika Korps for a couple of years was doing really well. Their commander was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, famous leader, the Desert Fox, who even the British considered to be a genius. And they beat us up, and they beat up the British. But eventually, we kind of strangled them. We cut off their supplies, we cut off their reinforcements, we cut off their ammunitions, and the whole Afrika Korps, the entire group, surrendered en masse, altogether, 170,000 German prisoners surrendering all at once in May 1943 in Tunis, Tunisia. And these Afrika Korps guys, a lot of them were hardcore Nazis. They had been grown up in the Hitler Youth. They had watched as, or taken part as Germany had overrun Western Europe without too much trouble. And they really felt like they were certain that their own capture was just a fluke, was just a speed bump. And they felt sure that Hitler would end up releasing them when Hitler eventually would bring America to its knees. So we've got for the time being, we've got 170,000 of these guys. What do you do with them? It's a great victory. It's a first big victory for America in Europe. But what do you do with all these guys? Great Britain is this tiny island nation, and they're already holding 500,000 German POWs. And they say, help. And we said, we're not sure we want to help. We're concerned that if we bring them over here, they're going to run roughshod. They're going to escape. So we said initially, we will take 50,000. That's it. That's all we'll take. Because any more than that is too big of a risk. But those national security concerns quickly gave way because there was just nowhere else to put these guys. Canada took some of them, but nobody had the space, nobody had the food, nobody had the guards to guard them like we did. So we decided, okay, we'll bring them over here. We start out 50,000, we add another 50, another 30. We finally we're taking 120,000 of these guys in America. Have the next slide, please. So we set out, we don't have any infrastructure, anywhere to keep these guys. So we start out, the Army is given the task of building this big network of POW camps in which to put these guys. And most of the camps, most of the big ones, this is a Camp Concordia in rural Kansas. And it's basically a 1 square mile stretch of land that was kind of bulldozed, and a cluster of cheaply built, crudely built wooden 1-story barracks was built around there, along with some support buildings. And these all surrounded, as you can kind of see there, with 2 9-foot barbed wire fences and guard towers with machine guns and searchlights and rifles. So we just started building these things just as fast as we could. And we wanted to put them in the south and the southwest because we thought it would be cheaper. But pretty soon, the Army realized that in order to accommodate all the Germans that were flowing into the country, we had to build them everywhere. The next one, Kima. So take a look at this map. Now it's just the first time I saw this, I thought, this can't be right. But it is. And this is and this isn't even really all of them because the Army didn't keep real close track of them. But this is the camps, the German POW camps that were in the United States between 1943 and 1946. And maybe 150 of these were these big camps with thousands and thousands of workers. Many of the others were smaller sort of branch camps. In some cases, they're just a tent city surrounded by barbed wire. But there are just 1 million of them. Next one, Kima. So, here come the Germans. After they surrender in Tunis, we put them on trains, cram them into these cattle cars and box cars. We take them to the North African ports of Oran and Casablanca. And these ports are where the American cargo ships are coming. They're coming from the US East Coast. They're hauling war supplies to our troops in North Africa. So once they empty their cargo holds of the supplies, they start cramming these POWs in like sardines. And here you can see thousands of them on a ship. And they bring the ships finish loading, they turn around, head back across the Atlantic to the US East Coast. And in one of the war's many ironies, for all these POWs, the journey to America, they were under constant threat from their own U-boats. But they ended up getting here. Let's see this. So when they arrive in the ports, and if you can picture some German POWs arriving in New York Harbor, they pull in a ship. This is a tremendous shock to them because Nazi propaganda had insisted to them that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was bombing the daylights out of our eastern cities, like New York and Miami, all the way down, because we were, in fact, bombing German cities. So the Nazi propagandists say, don't worry, we're giving as good as we're getting. We're bombing the daylights out of them. So a lot of these POWs, they come into New York Harbor, they're expecting to look up the skyline, they expect to see the skyline smoldering. They expect to see the buildings tilted sideways, almost like a post 9/11 site. But no, there's none of that. Everything looks fine. It's busy. The skyscrapers are gleaming. People are running around. It's like there's not even a war going on. So they're kind of confused by this. But the real hardcore Nazis in the group are saying, don't be fooled. The Americans are tricking you. They are purposely taking us only to ports where there is no damage. See, there's all kinds of ports on the coast that are all torn to pieces, but they're just taking us the ones where you can't see the damage. They're trying to trick you. And the other prisoners are thinking, well, maybe that's true, but we'll see. So they get to the ports, and from there, they're taken on trains, all to the final destination on their camps. And some of these train rides, they're going to Utah, they're going to California, they're going to West Texas, they're going to Arizona. Some of these train rides in Kansas last more than a week of just constant, hardly any stops, just rolling mile after mile after mile across the United States. And this too is a big shock to the Germans, because Hitler had been characterizing America as this frivolous country that was obsessed with sex and Hollywood and movie stars, and there's some truth to that, but we're a lot more than that. So the Germans are looking out here and they're seeing this huge, vast land, bigger than anything they expected. And it's a rich land. Everybody has a car. They can see that from the train windows. And the factories, the smoke is spiraling out of the stacks. The parking lots are full. And a lot of the Germans are thinking, yeah, maybe this is not really what we expected. Maybe America is a little more formidable than we pictured. But the Nazis had an answer for that too. They said, don't be fooled. The Americans are driving the trains around in circles to make America look bigger than it is. So don't fall for it. We just don't believe your lying eyes. Listen to our propaganda. But it gets a little harder and harder for some of these German soldiers to believe, because particularly even the trains they are traveling in. Because when we put them on trains and took them to their camps, these trains are surplus Pullman passenger coaches. So they're a little old, but they're still quite nice. They're comfortable, they're upholstered, there's bathrooms at either end of each car. There's regular food service, and the Germans they've never seen anything like this. This is an awakening to them, because in Germany, the German army always traveled in boxcars. So here they are riding in style to these camps. And they got used to the comfort, because they arrive in these camps, and we are going to treat them really well in these camps. We are going to follow the Geneva Convention rules about treating POWs to the letter. And so you have in the camps, the Geneva Convention says that they're not to be treated like criminals. They are loyal soldiers of their country. It was not even illegal for them to try to escape. They were entitled to escape if they were able to. So we had to, in order to treat them according to the Geneva Convention, they were allowed to have basically the same facilities, minus the barbed wire, that American troops on the home front had. And this translates into comfortable beds, lots and plenty of food. Next one, Kima. And here are some German POWs tucking into a big meal at one of the camps. And the Germans were amazed at all the food they were served, all the varieties of it. You know, they've got letters in the book where they're writing back saying, you know, we're getting fat. We haven't eaten this much since the war started or even before. And they're, Mom, don't worry about us anymore. We're being well taken care of. But it wasn't just the food. Next one, Kima. They were also entitled to have recreational facilities. So they had like athletic fields. And this picture, soccer, as some of you may know, is very big in Germany. So you've got some POWs playing in a soccer tournament with hundreds of other POWs, watching them play. It went even further. They had access to arts and crafts. So you had Germans, like there was an art studio. You could paint watercolors of landscapes, around the POW camp. You could, some of them made elaborate sculptures and different artwork, and they even put on plays. There was an American reporter that visited one of the camps and was just astonished to see an elaborate production of the play Faust, complete with a chorus and a lighting, facilities. It was just stunning. So this was a lot we were doing for the Germans, and it was too much for some Americans. Some Americans were just outraged that we're doing this, particularly families who had loved ones in Europe fighting and dying against the Nazis. These people are saying, why are we treating this ruthless enemy so well? Already the initial word of the Holocaust was starting to filter back to the United States. So why are we treating these guys so well? But America had really good reasons for doing that. And these reasons were both moral and selfish. The first one, America's leaders in those days, from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on down, believed that America should be the light of the world. We need to be an example to show other countries how to conduct themselves. And we taking care of prisoners, treating them right, treating them humanely is, it's the right thing to do. It's the American way. But from a selfish standpoint, we also thought that, if we treat these prisoners well, invariably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of our guys are going to be taken prisoner by the Germans and the Japanese. So it may be by treating the prisoners that we take well, it will encourage our enemies to treat captured Americans well. Because in World War II, humane treatment of prisoners was not a given at all. So far, the Germans had been treating prisoners from the West, Americans, British, Canadians, not as well as we were treating the Germans, but they were treating them pretty much according to the Geneva Convention. But on the Eastern Front, where the Germans were fighting the Russians, the Soviets, being a prisoner was a nightmare. They both sides slaughtered their prisoners, they enslaved them. So American authorities were wondering, how long is Hitler going to treat captured Americans well? And particularly, how is he going to treat them when invariably he finds his back against the wall? One of the things that the German camps quickly became very popular in the United States, because the Germans were enlisted prisoners could be compelled to work. So every day, 6 days a week, they were marched out of their camps, taken to a workplace, and march back in at the end of the night. And this was desperately needed in the United States because in World War II, American farms and factories and businesses had lost millions and millions of American workers who had gone to join the military to fight, or who had gone to work for the defense plants, which were booming and which usually paid better than farm work. So the need for labor just to pick crops, was desperate. And these Germans quickly filled this need. And came in the next one, please. And they did everything you could think of. Here they are picking corn in the Midwest. They picked oranges in Florida, cotton in the deep South, beets in Utah, you name it, they picked it. They herded cattle, they cleaned bedpans, they translated documents, pretty much any work that you could possibly think of, including, I'm told, some work in this area, they did. And it was a tremendously valuable. They basically saved a lot of American businesses, and particularly farms, from either going under or just being in very serious trouble. So along the way, these soldiers, the German soldiers, they would work maybe the same farm every day for weeks. And they got to know some of the Americans that not in the camps, but out when they were working on these work sites. They got to know the farmers, and the farmers got to know them. And they were young, most of them young guys. They were hard workers, and you had particularly in German American communities in the Midwest, the POWs were embraced almost like long lost relatives who'd made poor life decisions. And in fact, some of the families in the Midwest did have relatives who were POWs. I have a farmer from Nebraska, quoted in the book as saying, I kept reminding myself that these guys are the enemies, but how can you hate somebody who's helping to save your family farm? So you've got all some scenes there that are, to me, on one side they're a little heartwarming, and the other side they're a little disturbing. I have a guy, the farm wives at the end, a lot of them in the Midwest, at the end of a work day on the farm, would insist that all the POWs and the guards join the family around the family dinner table for fried chicken and mashed potatoes. And this was a gross violation of Navy regulations, but when you're out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, who's the boss, really? Exactly. So I have another case where a farmer recalled that at the end of the day, some POWs are walking back from the farm to the farmhouse, I guess, to eat, and the farmer's 8-year-old son is riding on the shoulders of one of these POWs. He's laughing and laughing, the little boy is laughing, and the German POW is, as he put it, playfully goose stepping on the way back to the farmhouse. So this was a very strange situation, and it was happening all over the country. And a lot of the Germans who were not the hardcore Nazis, but some of the other guys were getting to know the Americans and getting to know America and getting to see how America lived. And they were thinking, they wrote, and I've got some letters in the book, they wrote very movingly of what this experience was like. They said, we expected to be mistreated here and hated here, and these people they're nice to us. And look at the way they live. They're free to say what they want, they're free to think what they want, and they were just, a lot of them wanted to, at the end of the war, wanted to stay here. But the Nazis, the hardcore Nazis, and there were plenty of them in these camps, you couldn't make a statement like that in front of them, or they would punish you, because there was a lot of tension that was slowly building in these camps. And the problem was that the army at the beginning had assumed that all of these guys were just straight up thoroughgoing Nazis. So we're going to put all these Nazis in a camp. They didn't realize that there were Nazis, probably less than half were truly dedicated Nazis. The others were following because they were scared, or they were nationalists, or they had been reluctantly drafted into the German army. So quietly in these camps, when the Americans would leave the German parts of the camps for the night, the Nazis would use threats, intimidation, and violence to exact control over their fellow prisoners. And if you stepped out of line, if you said the wrong thing, if you made a comment about the news, one guy was called before a secret honor court for suggesting that perhaps Hitler had made a mistake by invading Russia. So there was this tension that was building in the camps, unbeknownst to the army. And it was only a matter of time before somebody got killed. And in October 1943, that happened. In a rural camp in Kansas, it was actually Camp Concordia that I showed you before earlier. A 30-year-old German officer is found hanged in his quarters, dangling from a makeshift noose. He's got a little suicide note nearby. He's got a chair that appears to be kicked out from under him. So at first they thought, well, it's a suicide. It wasn't, for a lot of these Germans, it was no picnic having to sit out the war on the Kansas prairie. But as soon as they buried this man, informants came forward. These were German informants. They came forward and they said, this man did not want to commit suicide. The hardcore Nazis in the camp forced him to do it. They basically handed him a clothesline and a chair. They had stolen his diary. He wasn't an agitator. They had stolen his diary and found that he had written in there that he thought Nazism would be the ruin of Germany. So on that basis, they held a clandestine kangaroo court and sentenced him to death. And they said, go kill yourself. And if you don't do it, we will get word, smuggle word back to Germany to have the Gestapo kill your wife. So this man paced back and forth and finally hanged himself. That was the first killing. A couple weeks later, a German POW in Oklahoma, rural Oklahoma in a camp, was brutally beaten to death by a mob of his fellow prisoners because he supposedly had tried to sneak a note to the Americans suggesting some bombing targets in Germany, trying to get the war over with earlier. A little while later, a prisoner in Texas is beaten to death because apparently he was working harder for the Americans than he was required to. And the Nazis wanted to make an example of him. Another prisoner in the same camp in Kansas is driven to suicide, and many of the same methods. Next one, Kim. In Arizona, 7 U-boat men, captured U-boat men, beat and strangled to death another U-boat man. This is one of the killers. This is a tough, unrelenting Nazi named Ralph Wizoy. He was one of the 7 that killed this man. And they killed him because he had actually become an informant for the naval intelligence. And they knew he had. And they argued afterwards that this killing, it really wasn't murder. It was loyal soldiers doing their duty, doing the only thing they could do to stop a traitor. And they asked, what would American soldiers do in a situation like that? And I think in this case, at least, it's kind of a fair question. In Arkansas, a POW was beaten to death just really because of rumors that supposedly he was close to the Americans. He hadn't really done anything. He was no threat to Germany, no threat to the Third Reich, no really threat to anybody. In South Carolina, another POW is strangled to death, left lying out there in a noose for everybody to see, just because the Nazis in the camp didn't like it. So there were other incidents like this that only were not murders because the guards stepped in too quickly. And there were hundreds of deaths that were officially classified as suicides, but almost certainly a number of those deaths were actually murders that the poor guards were not trained to recognize or investigate. So this was building to a kind of a critical mass, and the Army was getting concerned. Felt like they were kind of losing control of these camps. So they had been caught off guard, but they responded very aggressively. And they turned loose a bunch of investigators and prosecutors. And they said, we want you to bring the killers in these camps to justice. Next one, Kima, please. Keep going. Keep going. One more. Yep. one back. This is was the main prosecutor. And you may, if you look closely, you might recognize this guy. His name is Leon Jaworski. And you might recognize him because decades later, he was the special prosecutor in the Watergate case. And it was his dogged pursuit of the White House audio tapes that ultimately forced President Richard Nixon to resign. But in the 1940s, Jaworski was a hard-charging prosecutor for the Army's JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General's Office, the legal arm of the Army. And he took it to heart when the generals told him, I want you to go after these guys. And he prosecuted these guys hard, and so did the other prosecutors. So together, the prosecutors hauled 15 German POWs before secret U.S. military tribunals. And these are hand-picked panels of American military officers, and court-martialed them. And these were all very complete secrecy. Court-martialed them for murder. And these military tribunals rather quickly convicted all 15 Germans of murder and sentenced them to die, sentenced them to hang, and took them to Fort Leavenworth. And as some of you may know, Fort Leavenworth is a storied fort on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River in the eastern Kansas. And it's also the home to the maximum security military prison. And this is a photo of the prison, and you see this one big building that sort of dominates the scene. That was a big rotunda. And this place everyone called this place the castle. And death row in the castle, where these 15 Germans were, was in a gloomy basement wing of the castle. So they sat there in individual cells waiting basically for the hangman. Under the Geneva Convention, which again we followed very closely, we were required to notify the government of Nazi Germany that we had convicted these guys of murder and we intended to execute them. We had to give them 3 months' notice. So we sent the Germans some documents and said, here are these guys, here are the charges, here are the verdicts, just kind of bare bones stuff. We sent it to them. We said, we're getting ready to execute your guys. The Germans responded angrily. And curiously, they said, wait, we need to know something about these cases. You know, what exactly were the circumstances of these killings? You know, what evidence was presented at the court-martials? What defense was offered? But the U.S. authorities, the War Department, particularly Secretary of War Henry Stimson, just kind of brushed them off. He said, sorry, we've told you everything we need to tell you. You don't have any say in this. We're going to hang the guys. We were required to notify you, but that's all we had to do. So the Germans protested, and they kind of vaguely threatened, and they were a little more specific in their threats. And finally, on the 29th and 30th of December, 1944, and at this time the Battle of the Bulge is raging in the snowy woods near Bastogne, Belgium, they rounded up 15 American POWs in German custody and hauled them before secret military tribunals and sentenced them to death. Most of these cases were really for relatively minor charges. And just to give you an idea, the next one, Keith. This is one of the 15 Americans. This is a tough, imposing U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel named William Schaefer. And his men nicknamed him King Kong. That's the kind of guy he was. And Schaefer was he was never content to just be a quiet, compliant prisoner. He believed that it was his duty as a POW to make life as miserable as possible for every German that he came in contact with. So he was constantly doing little things to get on their nerves, to harass them. And he carried around a dog-eared copy of the Geneva Convention, and he would, if they told him to do something, he'd look it up and say, "Oh, you violated the Geneva Convention." And his favorite thing, if a guard or a German officer really made him mad, he had a full set of false teeth. He would take them out, point them at the person he wanted to make angry, and clack them just as fast as he could. So he was a piece of work. But Schaefer was sentenced to death because he and another man named Lieutenant James Schmitz were both sentenced to death because one day they briefly, just for a second, symbolically stood in the way of a German sergeant in their POW camp who was trying to tack up an obnoxious propaganda poster on the POW's bulletin board. You know, they didn't stop him from putting it up. There was no acts of violence, but the Germans said, death. So on that basis, these two guys were condemned to death. Next one, Keeman. Here's another one of the 15 Americans. And this is a cocky fighter pilot. Colonel Henry Spicer flew a P-51 Mustang on bombing run, protect the bombers on their runs over Berlin. And he was shot down over the French coast and taken to a POW camp. And Henry was sentenced to death for giving a speech. And what he had done is, one day in the camp, he felt the Germans had been harassing the man. He was in command of a bunch of POWs. They felt like he'd been harassing them. So he stood up and he said, "Be strong. Don't let these SOBs get you down. The Germans are terrible people. They're committing war crimes." And Henry said, "I personally don't mind if I have to rot in this hole, this POW camp, for 10 years, if during that time the entire German army is wiped off the face of the earth." Those were almost his exact words. And for that speech, he was condemned to death. One more guy I'll show you. This guy lived out his final years in Chesapeake, only a half hour from my home. And his name is, he is a very courageous Italian-American named Louis Biagioni. And Biagioni was recruited by the OSS, the Office of Special Services, which is a forerunner of the CIA, to spy. So he parachuted in the dark of the moon into Nazi-occupied Italy to serve as a spy. He was caught by the Gestapo. So these are the 15, they represent kind of the 15 Americans that were caught up in this thing and essentially used as hostages to try to get the Germans back. The Americans knew nothing about all these death sentences, knew nothing that these guys had been sentenced to death until the 9th of January, 1945, when a startling telegram comes from the German High Command from Berlin. Through the Swiss, everything came through the Swiss. They were our intermediaries. And it basically said, "We've sentenced a bunch of Americans to death. And we know you're holding these Germans at Fort Leavenworth. We'll trade you." And, a life for a life. 15 lives for 15 lives. And Americans were outraged. Initially, they're saying, "This is ridiculous. These guys in Leavenworth, they're murderers. They committed brutal killings. And you want us to trade them for these Americans who've really done very little wrong, hadn't really hurt anybody. But gradually they face the fact that, what is going to happen? How's it going to look if we tell we tell the Germans we're not interested, and these guys end up getting executed? So reluctantly, we began negotiating with the Germans, with the Nazis, and about an exchange. And it was, sometimes there was bartering. They said that the Germans at one point said Biagioni, since he was a spy, was worth 2 of these Germans at Fort Leavenworth. And it was very confusing. It went back and forth, and it was built. We at one point suggested an exchange, a 2-part exchange on the border of Switzerland and Germany. We were going to, at one point, where the Germans would cross over into Germany, we'd let them go. Another point, the Americans would be released. So while this is going on, while these negotiations are going on, this is the spring of 1945, and Germany is rapidly coming apart at the seams. On the western side, the American, Canadian, and British forces are smashing into Germany. And on the east side, the Russians are just bulldozing everything in their sight. They are on a mission of vengeance. So Nazi Germany is just collapsing at this point. So my book tracks these progress of these negotiations at a time when these the Allied armies are conquering parts of Germany, including some of the POW camps where some of the condemned Americans are being held. So again, the book follows this climax as the war comes to a chaotic end. That's, next one, Kima. That's essentially what the book is about. I'd be happy to, thanks for your attention. I would be happy to take any questions that you all might have.